area there. As a water person, we were immediately saying, this is water scarcity. Of course. But then everybody said, well, it's climate because everything is climate today. But anyway, and is it unique also? You have to think, is it unique? Well, if you take a longer run, I'm a paleoclimatologist. I love long time series. I'm really in love with it. But this one is very short, it's only 100 years. But of course, if you look at the food prices, you can see that things have happened in the past as well. And there are correlations with things going on. Mostly it's politics though. It appears to be politics. It appears that it is not really sort of natural things happening. It's more politics behind food prices. So I would like to take a few, just lift a few sort of drivers. And I know this is extremely sort of naive, just picking out a few, but I find them to be fascinating. Population as number one. Quite often we tend to forget this issue, but the driver, after all, will be population and the growth and dynamics of populations. And, you know, again, it's fantastic. At the web today, you can find the population clock giving you the numbers by the second. Isn't that fascinating? Someone is sitting there actually counting. And you have, on the 12th of June 1955 at 12:10:20, that's what you have, okay? 2.7 billion. And then, of course, in 2011, we are at this level now. We are approaching very quickly 7 billion people, okay? So what about the future? Well, of course, the future is not what it used to be, and it's very uncertain. The only thing you can say about the future is that you will be wrong, you know, and it's really difficult. But according to this, the speculation here is close to 9 billion in 2051. What is interesting then is beyond that, because there are uncertainties, and in this particular one, this population growth, this is what they say about 2100 going down. And this has consequences, as you know, of course. Aging populations and so on. But then the density also, we heard about the problem with urban sprawl, and you can see that the population densities correlate very well with good agricultural land. We tend to live where the money once was. Of course, now it's not enough money in agriculture, unfortunately. And we have to look at the dynamics of populations as well. It's not just about the numbers, and we know that. So look at the spread of megacities, more than 7 million people. This is 1950. It's not that long ago, even though I wasn't born. But it's not that long ago. So in one generation, what happens? Well, this is 2015. This is amazing. I mean, if you think about it, the number of people moving into cities, the fact that we from 2005, according to UN Habitat, more people are living in cities. And that is new in human history. And of course these cities are, again, in agriculture areas, coastal areas, etc. But what is maybe even more interesting is, of course, to look at the economy, because population growth is one thing. That is not really the major problem. It's the problem or the challenge and the opportunities, of course, that our economies are growing as well. And as you know, not least after the financial crisis, it's very difficult to predict. Economists are probably worse than climate experts when it comes to predicting the future. So predictions are very uncertain, but we are talking about 10 to 25 times bigger economy in 2050, population 0.5 times larger in the same period. It's amazing if you look at that, of course. What does it mean if you bring it down to people level? Well, one example is to say that in 2008, about 800 million people lived in regions, countries, where GDP per capita was more than $10,000. If we look at the trends, in 2050, 7 billion people will live in such areas. That's the middle class we are talking about, basically. That's the development of the global middle class. That is an opportunity. That is something we should strive for. I mean, we cannot strive for keeping people who do not have a good living, try to keep them away from that. That's a global responsibility. But of course, it will have impact, but it is an opportunity. So it's not only about poverty alleviation, of course. It's also very fundamentally important to look beyond poverty, to really think about this thing that China could have an economy 3 times larger than the global economy in 2040. What are the impacts of that? What will be the pressure on food systems? What will we produce? What will we eat? Of course we are trying to make projections, and you are now the experts here more than I am, of what we potentially will produce in the future. And I personally think that many of these numbers are very much underestimations, not least, for instance, for sub-Saharan Africa. 10 of the 15 fastest growing economies today are in Africa. Why shouldn't we expect to see similar trends there as we've seen in Asia and OECD? Of course. Climate change, to say a few words about it, of course I have to also add a few things about climate change, but I would like to put it in a different perspective. Again, maybe my paleoclimatological background is shining through here, but I mean, climate change is one of the absolute major issues, but the challenge is really, and this is dangerous to say, so listen more carefully so you don't misinterpret me. I don't think the climate change is the problem, it's that we don't really know what will happen. So, yes, the change is dramatic, but the real challenge is that we don't know exactly what will happen, and it's going to be very difficult to predict. Because if we could plan better, we could probably cope with climate change. It's the uncertainty. Just take an example. Oh, sorry, first I have to show the Köppen map of the world. And I always put this in to remind ourselves that climate is very dynamic without climate change. And agriculture people tend to know that after 10,000 years of experience. So it's not so new for you. But the Earth is actually giving us certain conditions. And we tend to forget, especially modern people living in urban areas, we tend to forget that. We take for granted that we should fix things. But there are certain limitations provided by the natural climate. But anyway, I take my favorite example, Australia. Australia, this is the precipitation in Australia over 100 years. And of course, if you actually, up until a few years back, if you ask someone generally, is it getting drier or wetter in Australia? Most people say it's getting drier. Actually, if you look at the trend, there is a slight increase in precipitation. It was low values a few years back, now we have high values again, as you know. And the challenge here is, of course, and this is coming back to how do you plan things? This is continental scale. Is that interesting for a farmer? Is that good for a farmer? If we go out to farmers and tell them, well, precipitation in Europe will decrease by 20%. Great, I will plan accordingly. Well, we have these kind of trends for, of course, in many countries, and of course also at a lower level than the national, or the national one, continental in this case. But look at what happened also. So, actually precipitation is increasing in Australia. But where is the precipitation fall? So this is the last 50 years. 50% basically decrease here, where most of the agriculture is and where most of the people live, and a 50% increase here. So it's a complete shift, if you look at a continental scale. So when you look at climate, and is this climate change? Well, let it be. I mean, it doesn't really matter. If something has shifted, it may shift back. But when we plan, this is the reality we have to plan from, of course. And it's not enough then to look at one parameter. And you know that, of course. But unfortunately, a lot of policymakers, they are looking at temperature, basically. And that's the parameter. It's nothing else. So there is a dilemma. If you look at many of the future models, although this one is a few years old, what is interesting here is the yellow areas, because the yellow areas show areas in the world where these models that were used for this one projection, one of them saying precipitation will increase, and the other one says it will decrease. So that's the 25 plus, minus 25 plus 25 dilemma. So if you are a politician in Australia, and you're asking your scientists, what should we plan for in 2050? What will happen with precipitation? Because that's the key resource for Australia. As scientists, we still have to answer mostly, it will increase or decrease. Water, I take as an example of a natural resource, a natural example to take, of course, in a setting like this. And I will just say a few words. What is interesting here, you see that, again, the private sector, this is just an example of how the chairman of Nestlé addressed issues of low water and food security at Harvard Kennedy School. You see that, I mean, these issues are really picking up, of course, also in the private sector, not least, and Nestlé, of course, not least. Just like climate, there is a natural water bank account, I would argue, that we tend to forget again. We think we can tamper with water and make more out of it. And I must say, when when I'm out speaking about water, talking about water, even in the private, not least in the private sector, I always get a question when it comes to agriculture and water. Why don't we just desalinize? And of course, it's a pretty difficult problem. And one of the reasons it's difficult, well, you know that, of course, it's, you know, how much water do we need actually? And I'm sure you can contest many of these, but if you ask, I promise, if you ask people in Sweden how much water you need for survival, 90% would say this, 2 to 5 liters per day. 90% would still say that. I've tested at university studies, or with university students. And of course, all